Russian President Vladimir Putin seemingly avoided a coup over the weekend. Friday, the leader of the Wagner group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was also a longtime ally of Putin, launched a rebellion against the Kremlin, leading his fighters from the front lines of Ukraine on a march toward the Russian capital. A supposed deal to avoid bloodshed allowed the Wagner group leader to live in exile to avoid charges of treason, but there are reports that the Federal Security Service is still investigating.
And this attempted coup has apparently left its mark on the Russian-backed commander of the separatist forces in Ukraine, reportedly tweeting, "The country will never be the same again." Joining us now to weigh in is retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, senior fellow and military expert at Defense Priorities. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Robbie.
We're so grateful to have you on because we really need your expertise here. What exactly happened, and what should, from a U.S. perspective, or perspective of wanting peace and not escalating tensions between Russia and the U.S., what would be like an outcome to hope for here?
Well, right now we're limited to just watching from the outside in the stands, so to speak. We don't have any play at all in this. And it is one of the most bizarre turn of events I have ever even read about or experienced in my lifetime. This actually goes back, though, not just, within the last 48, 72 hours, but really goes back all the way to January, because Prigozhin had begun making a series of increasingly provocative public statements accusing the Russian Ministry of Defense and the senior general in charge of their armed forces, Gerasimov, of all kinds of things, and intentionally holding back ammunition, wanting the Wagner group to fail, and many similar things like that. And it started this really big friction between the two, which was starting to have an impact on the ground. And then Prigozhin progressively took it worse and worse and worse until he finally accused the Ministry of Defense of outright attacking his men, and that's what allegedly sparked the move forward. But it looks like he was actually planning this, and that was probably just something for the film and the cameras to get, because he was already prepared to make this move. The big issue, though, is this is not like a classic coup in the sense that they wanted to topple the government and take control. He, even in his most angry, said, hey, this is not against Putin. This is against Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Gerasimov. And so he was making this move to try and get them out of power. And it remains to be seen what deal was actually struck behind the scenes, because we still don't know much about what's actually happened. But at least from Putin's perspective, the immediate crisis has been averted. But there are going to be some probably tremors and aftershocks coming following this.
Yeah, I want you to unpack that a little bit more for us, if you could, because the U.S. media, or many, I should say maybe liberal parts of the U.S. media, were really characterizing the march to Moscow as a real indictment of Putin, a threat to Putin. There was almost a cheering on of the Wagner group. And it did seem to miss the kind of posture of what's going on there, where, as I understand it, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, the Wagner group had been instrumental in Russian successes in Bakhmut. There was a kind of credibility that the Wagner group gained from that, but that was embarrassing in some ways to the generals because they were I don't know how you describe it, a mercenary group of some kind. And that is where the tension fundamentally lay, not between the Wagner group and Putin per se. And if that's accurate, what do you make then of how this whole escapade has been characterized by the U.S. media?
Well, I mean, you got to know that the U.S. media and the Western altogether, definitely in Kiev, loves to characterize anything that happens negative in Russia in the worst possible light. This certainly has provided much grist for that mill because a lot of bad things have happened too. But one of the things that this does show about the weakness of Putin is that he allowed this to get to this stage. And I think that's a question that many of his even supporters are starting to grumble about a little bit, because as I pointed out, even back in February, there was a big explosion. Then there was a major one in May where he accused the Russians' leadership of doing all kinds of terrible things. Putin took no action to any of that. Now, part of the reason that he did that is because the Wagner group has been absolutely unique and unprecedented in the Russian side of military success. They helped take Mariupol in the early part of the war, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Popasna, Solidar, and then finally Bakhmut. No other Russian organization has anywhere near that much offensive success. And Putin didn't want to upset the cart too much because he wanted to keep that formation for the next fight that he's going to get ready to fight probably this summer. And I think he gave Prigozhin too much leeway. And then now it blew up in his face like this. But one other thing I want to point out in terms of what was actually trying to be occurred here by Prigozhin, I can't imagine that he actually thought he could topple the government, because all of their equipment, all of their ammunition, fuel, everything comes from the Ministry of Defense. They don't get it independently. So they can't turn literally militarily against the Ministry of Defense and think that they're going to, continue to get ammunition. They would have run out right away. There's no way they could have assaulted Moscow and had a military success. They would have all been killed. So I rather think that it's more probable that Prigozhin was playing a great game of chicken to try and force Putin's hand. And we'll see, because there's been lots of reports along a lot of credible Russian sources that suggest that behind the scenes that both Shoigu and Gerasimov may be on the way out, but they want to do it in such a way that it doesn't appear that it was a direct response to what Prigozhin said. But I'll be surprised if they stay much longer in their positions.
It definitely does seem like there was, like Brianna said, coming from liberal media sources over the weekend, or people who are very pro continuing to arm and fund Ukraine, that there was a kind of pretending that the Wagner group, could in fact take over, depose Putin, and that this might be, this might be good for the Ukrainian cause, or from the more hawkish U.S. perspective, regime change in Russia, without a lot of acknowledgement, right? And again, correct me if I'm wrong, we know very little about this, especially compared to you, but that the Wagner group itself has some extremist ties as well. And, this would not be, it's kind of the classic American imagining that, oh, we replace Saddam, it'll be better. We'll replace, X bad person, then it'll be better, without any real evidence that, I take what you're saying, that this was not ever going to be an actual replace Putin thing. But if it even was, that would be good for Ukraine or good for the U.S. doesn't actually make a lot of sense.
Well, look, first of all, we got to look at the military capability. It took 9 months for the Wagner group to take a city of 70,000. Let that sink in for a second, instead of I think 10 million in Moscow. So they were never going to be able to do anything. And that was sheer fantasy on anybody to think that. But Robbie, I think that this is exposing a bigger issue, kind of back to your question a minute ago about what the United States should be doing. This is really starting to expose that Russia's conventional military power and internal political unity is quite frayed. And the threat or the risk of American national interest or of NATO is much lower than anybody thought. And I think that what we should do is just kind of stand back and say, hey, we're going to continue to defend every inch of NATO as our treaty obligates us to it, as our long-term commitments require, keep our security, but say, hey, look, it's time for the Europeans to pick up a lot more of this, because we see that they can handle this with their military. And should be no need or expectation that America will always provide the front level of support and put all the forces and pay all the money and give all the ammunition and weapons ahead of everybody else. It is time not for rebalancing, but actually burden shifting safely over to our European allies. I think that it's time to start realizing that we don't need to be taking the front in every kind of conflict over there.
That's a fascinating read, because so much of what is underpinning kind of America's foreign policy framing in the region is the idea that Putin has these broad, lofty territorial ambitions to conquer all of Europe. And you're saying that what we should take from this is that they frankly cannot, and they can barely hold down the fort at home. And that not only should we not be concerned about that, and that shouldn't be a motivation to NATO expansion or what have you, but it should also cause us to take a lighter share of handling the defense of the rest of Europe, broadly speaking, from a military perspective.
That's 100% correct. And look, this is not putting anybody at threat or risk. This is exposing what really many of us have been saying for a long time, that Russia doesn't have the military capacity to even threaten one NATO nation, much less 31, or soon to be 32 probably. So this shows that it is very safe. European countries are completely capable of handling the security, because the threat is almost non-existent. Because you see, after 16 months of war, Russia has still hanging on to about 17% of Ukraine, and they haven't been able to go much more than. It's uncertain whether they will make good on their summer offensive or not. That's still to be seen. But even in that case, They might get another few hundred kilometers or so within the country, and they might not get any. But the bottom line is they cannot go further. And so it is no longer required that America has to always be at the forefront of putting everything up front while our rich European allies sit back and let us do it. And they can do it. And that's what I think we need to shift to, what's appropriate for American economic and national security, and for the Europeans to pick up their fair share.
Well, this morning on CNN, former National Security Advisor John Bolton had this to say about the attempted coup and how the Biden administration should respond.
Well, I think that is a possibility, but I have to say, I think all of us have to avoid strenuously drawing overbroad conclusions from insufficient data. And right now, we have radically insufficient information about a whole host of things, starting with the coup and attempted coup and what happened to it and what the future holds. I have my own doubts about how serious this coup effort was and what kind of threat it actually posed to Putin. And I have my doubts. It clearly amounts to a weakening of Putin's position, but whether it's fatal, as some people seem to think, I have my doubts about that. We just don't know enough. And I think that's one very good reason why the White House has done very little here. And that's a position they should hold to.
So that's interesting. John Bolton is a figure I think we've all criticized a number of times, but he seems there to be saying basically along the lines of what you've said.
I was, when you said John Bolton, I was almost prepared reflexively to say, oh, that's nonsense. But in this case, I'm like, wow, I agree with every word he said. I don't find myself in that position very often, but he's completely right. We don't need to do anything, don't need to take any position, and we definitely don't know a great many facts. So I'm obviously all for him on this one.
So can you update us just a little bit quickly now about where we are, the role that Belarus played in helping to unwind this, and what we expect to hear next from the Wagner Group?
Yeah, that's actually another part of the reason why Putin has been weakened, because he was not able to solve this on his own. And Lukashenko is almost considered a joke among European and Western leaders, is that he's just kind of a puppet for Putin, and Putin saved him in 2020 from an internal issue in his country. But now that without Prigozhin, it's very possible that convoy, though it could never have captured Moscow, it could have had to fight a big, horrible, bloody clash with other Russians, and could have just been really, really bad for both Putin himself and for the country as well, with Russian on Russian fighting, so close to the capital. He seems to have prevented that, and apparently did a pretty good job with that. So people are going to be wondering why it took Lukashenko to do something that Putin wasn't able to, and he's going to have to answer for that one himself. But in terms of the second part about what's up for Wagner, that's what everybody's waiting to find out right now, to include the Russians and the Ukrainians and everybody, because Wagner has not, Prigozhin has not been seen since that time, and we don't know for sure where he's going, what he's going to do when he get there, what's going to happen with the Wagner Group that are in Luhansk right now. Are they going to continue to fight for Russia as a unit? Are they going to just dissolve and be absorbed in the Ministry of Defense? No one knows any of those things right now.
Well, according to the White House, President Joe Biden spoke with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky about the Russia rebellion, where Biden, quote, reaffirmed unwavering U.S. support, including through continued security, economic, and humanitarian aid. Thank you, Colonel Davis, for joining us. More Rising right after this.
Thanks, Robbie.